All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm marketing operations here at Smarty. Today's webinar is about using ChatGPT to improve your coding, and we're very excited to get started, and we're assuming you are too. But before I introduce our presenters, let's go over just a couple housekeeping items. One, yes, this webinar will be recorded. We're recording it right now, and we will send a copy of that recording to everyone who registered for this session. So if you need to step out early, you'll still get that recording later today. Also, if you feel that there's someone else that may benefit from this session, you'll be able to send that link to them and they can view this at any time. To interact with our presenters and other audience members, in fact, feel free to use the chat and Q&A features inside of the Zoom webinar interface. I'll be watching the chat. We'll bring up some of those questions directly to our presenters so that no questions left behind. So please do use that. All right, so speaking of our presenters, today we have Charlton and Ryan Cox, two of our software developers with us, and we're very excited to hear what they're going to share with us. So without further ado, Adam and Ryan.
All right, Ryan, so let's jump right into this. So as Andrew very helpfully pointed out, today we're going to be talking about ChatGPT and how we can use it to best integrate ChatGPT, this brand new technology, into your workflow as a programmer in order to not just write better code, but hopefully faster, more accurately, remove a couple of the steps that you as a person would manually have to go through in order to help get some of this code out to production. We've both been using ChatGPT quite a bit in preparation for this webinar, and we each have our own different personal experiences and thoughts that we're going to share to you as well. But sort of the premise that we'd like to do here is we'd like to do a live coding exercise. We have a problem that we'd like to code up, and we're going to go through the steps of using ChatGPT to hopefully come up with a complete product by the end of the webinar. So the premise for this, the problem that we're going to try and solve, is that of a targeted advertising campaign. So let's say that your business, you shipped a product to a customer. And people talk to their neighbors, they talk to their friends. And so if they really like your product, there's a good chance that they're going to be talking about it with all the people around them. So how about we as a company send advertisements to all the people in their vicinity? And we can do that using, of course, here at Smarty, we have some products that deal with addresses, and we're going to see if we can get ChatGPT to interface with some of our public-facing projects to see if we can come up with this product. So without further ado, let's hop into this. Oh, by the way, we're going to be using Python as our primary coding language. I don't have a ton of experience with Python. Ryan, do you have a ton of experience with Python?
No, I don't, which will make this kind of fun. We're gonna find out and learn together as we go.
But hopefully, we neither of us have a ton of experience, but ChatGPT hopefully will be able to push their own inexperience and get to a good solution. So one of the things that I've noticed, and I've done this a couple of different times in preparation and practice for this, with a big enough problem, ChatGPT doesn't typically do a good job on a really big problem. Let's see what it can come up with. So if we just type our base problem into it, and while I'm typing, Ryan, maybe you can talk about your thoughts on why it doesn't do quite well with a large enough problem, or when you try and get it to code up a big enough problem.
I believe No, go ahead. I believe it has something to do with context. So you build on the context as you're interacting with ChatGPT. You want to give it an initial prompt that's fairly specific, but not too specific. And then you want to build off of that prompt. So keep asking it more questions to reduce the scope or to make what it's producing more specific from there. But also, if we were to just say, hey, give me some code that validates addresses, it probably wouldn't produce exactly what we want. We have to be a little more specific.
And so let's see what it does. And so here I told it to, given an address, get all of the close addresses. And let's see what happens. So it looks like it is using the correct Smarty Streets API. And it has a lot of the good features. What it spit out is a lot of the good really good boilerplate, the stuff that you kind of got to do every single time you access the API. That's just sort of tedium to write, especially for someone who's not really familiar with our product. Having to go to the documentation, look up the auth ID, auth token that you needed, where to fit it in within the URL request. It's sort of tedious, and it's really nice that it gets it all out of the way. However, I can tell you right now, just sort of from knowledge with the product, this isn't going to work. And so let's copy the code and paste it into our terminal so that we can see that working. Just for security, I'm not actually going to be pasting in my my auth ID and auth token. So just for the sake of being able to have some security, we're going to be pulling that from our environment variable.
And we should always do that. That's a best practice. That way you don't accidentally check your auth ID or auth token into a public repository, because that is not good. So this is a best practice across the board.
So let's go ahead and run this code and see what we get. So it looks like no close address is found. And so we can go into it and we can debug through it. And this is one of the real hard problems with ChatGPT, is sometimes it will just break for no apparent reason. I know that a lot of developers are seeing all of this code that ChatGPT is able to spit out. I mean, let me tell you, when I was first practicing with this as a developer, being able to see you put in just straight English and being able to spit out code was quite terrifying. I was wondering how much longer I'd have a job. But then the more that you play with it, I'm realizing that you still really need a developer's touch with this. It doesn't spit out perfect code. It has a bunch of, now in this particular reason, the reason why it didn't work is because the sample address that it gave is complete garbage. So I'm going to be putting in another sample address that we had prepped. But it has bugs sometimes, and those bugs can be notoriously tricky to track down, especially because you didn't write the code yourself. And so it still takes a level of familiarity with the problem space and with code itself in order to come up with a good solution.
A quick question has popped up. Could you repeat what you said about API key best practices to avoid accidentally exposing it to the public?
Yeah, Ryan, would you go into that?
Sure. Do you want to scroll to the top of your code there, Adam?
Of course.
So you can see what Adam, what he pasted up there at the top. He's asking for the environment variables, Smarty auth ID and Smarty auth token. We're on Macintosh machines, which is a Linux or a Unix derivative, which means that we're able, in our bash shell or in our shells, we set these environment variables, Smarty auth ID and Smarty auth token, to the actual auth ID and auth token. Then in our code, everywhere in our code, we can query that environment variable for the actual values of the auth ID and auth token. That way, this code can be checked in, it can be open sourced, and it's perfectly safe. The auth ID and auth tokens are only stored locally on the machine that we're on. Hopefully that was clear.
Yeah, it's a way to protect yourself.
You never want to
keeping your key.
Yeah, you never want to hard code your keys or tokens in your code.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. So we copy pasted this code from ChatGPT. We made a slight modification to how we're doing the authentication tokens, and we ran it. And what happened is that it gave us close addresses for 4810 Eagle Boulevard, and it gave us 4810 Eagle Boulevard. Great, and nothing else. So the reason why it's doing that is because ChatGPT made a bit of a mistake with this code. This API, US Street API, it has a lot of functionality, but getting your neighbors is not one of them. It completely made up this functionality. It's using completely the wrong API for what it's trying to do. So that's sort of what happens when you give it too broad of a prompt. It doesn't exactly know where to start. I told it to use the Smarty Streets API, and it did that. It used a Smarty Streets API, and it took a Smarty Streets API that can take in an address and do something with it. But it doesn't quite know that it can't give all of its neighbors. At its core, ChatGPT really is just a next word algorithm.
So I'm curious here, and I'm not curious. I know what the answer is. You queried at the top using the Smarty Streets API. If I were to search using the Smarty API, would it pull the same information, or what's the value of saying Smarty Streets versus Smarty?
We rebranded about 2 years ago now, if I'm not mistaken, from Smarty Streets to Smarty. ChatGPT was only trained on data through around 2020,
So
2021.
Beginning of 2021.
Yeah, so ChatGPT and its training data knows us as Smarty Streets, not as Smarty. So that's the reason we're using our old name there instead of our new one.
I guess
just get better results.
That's the biggest secret. If you guys are going to use this, don't look for Smarty.
Yeah, well, in using ChatGPT, it's really important that you keep that in mind. It is not trained on the absolute latest human knowledge data. It's only trained through whatever year it is. It says on its front page, I think it's 2021.
Yeah, like early 2021, I believe.
Yeah, so that's important to keep in mind. You can kind of get it. You can give it context for things that are past that. Like we could tell ChatGPT that Smarty Streets has changed names to Smarty, and then start asking questions and referring to it that way in subsequent prompts.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you.
So this code didn't quite work. The way that I've found to fix problems such as these is to break it up into smaller chunks. This is too broad of a prompt. It didn't quite know how to approach it. But if we use some of our domain knowledge about the problem space, and we can say, oh, there's two different products that we can use. We have an address validation engine, which can give us a geocode. And then we also have a geocode or reverse geocode product, which takes a location and then returns a list of all of the nearby addresses. And if we combined these two different APIs, it should give us the solution that we want. And this is a little bit of an optimization, but I found that if you start going down the wrong path a little bit with, too broad of a prompt, ChatGPT is very capable of using its previous responses in context. And I found that it is sometimes easier just to start a brand new chat. So that is what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to say using the Smarty Streets API, write a function in Python that takes an address and returns a geocode. And this is constrained enough, it's small enough in scope that it's able to put out a pretty good answer. We're saying specifically write a function that has this input and this output using this particular API.
Or at least it did when you practiced.
Or at least I did when it practiced. Yeah. And just in case things start to go horribly wrong, I promise I have a validated backup chat here where I actually replicated this whole problem.
One of the other things to remember with ChatGPT is that it's not deterministic. So you can give it the same prompt a few different times and you'll get different answers each time, especially as you continue to interact with that prompt and ask new questions, you'll get different answers.
And then once again, let's see if I can move this out of the way so I can do it. We are going to be doing best practices so that we don't paste our credentials all over the internet. So here's the function that it gave. It also gave one sample piece of code for us to try out the function. So we might as well paste that in ourselves. Again, it gave a really generic city, state, zip. So let's go ahead and paste in our sample address again. And let's give this a shot. I have covered my run button. It said 404, not found. So what happened here is that, again, it completely hallucinated our API. It got a completely different result than the last time that I tried this, which was yesterday. So let's go back and tell it that that's not the right API and see what happens, that that's not the right URL. Because sometimes it will be able to correct it.
Yeah.
A question, was that token available? Sorry, was that token visible in the error?
It was. So we'll have to expire those.
So let's see. And it now uses the correct URL.
If you want to speed up the results that ChatGPT gives you, you can say, just give me the code, and it'll just spit out the code without all the explanatory text. Sometimes that's helpful. Sometimes it's not. Makes it a little faster.
So right here goes down and it says geocode not found. And so here's where we start to get our paychecks as developers a little bit, because ChatGPT pasted code. It didn't panic immediately when we told it to fix it. But now it's not quite giving us the information that we want. Having tested this address personally, I know that this address does have a geocode. Our API does in fact work and give us results on this. And so we have to begin to debug through it. And this is actually really fascinating for me, because even as of yesterday, pasting these exact same prompts, I was getting different results. Why do you think that ChatGPT can vary so wildly, even on a day-to-day basis?
I know that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe there was some subtle difference in the way you asked the question yesterday, or the way the prompts you put in. That's possible. Maybe it had some more context, so you had more questions in a row.
So one thing that we're just going to be really safe with is we're going to error out we're going to blank out our auth ID and auth token as we are debugging through this. And let's just try and have a debug statement here and see what we can get. Let's see if it's the problem with getting the response, or if the problem is with getting the data. So right here we have our data, and it looks like we got a valid match. We go into our metadata and we can see that we have a latitude and longitude right there. We even got a rooftop precision. So we are getting the data correct. We're just not iterating into it correctly. So because it is trying to get the candidate and it just fails. So this if statement right here, it doesn't seem to be working correctly.
Let's feed that back into ChatGPT, let it know that that's incorrect, and ask it to fix it.
How would you phrase that?
I would just
with the line number. Does it typically work with line numbers indirectly, or do I have to paste in the specific line that's erroring?
You have to paste in the specific line. As far as I know.
Do you start it with, now listen here?
You can, but if it's actually
you want to give some background?
Sure.
I was always nice to you.
Thing?
You'll be last to die.
Yes.
I wonder if did I paste the wrong code? That would be embarrassing. I did. I pasted the wrong code. It actually changed that if statement.
Oh, it did for you.
Whoops.
Yeah, right.
Let's go ahead and fix that. And let's go ahead and run it. Hey, there it goes. Okay, so it actually gave us our latitude and longitude when I actually, decided to use the correct code from ChatGPT. And so we have phase one of the problem. So we gave it an address, and then it spit out its location on a map. Now we can use the second API, the reverse geocoding API, to take that location and give us all of the neighbors. And once again, we're going to be using Smarty Streets because its data is only so current. And you have to tell it specifically to use the reverse geocoder API, because otherwise it'll try and use our most popular API, which is the street validation. And there we go. I know it's the most exciting webinar content is watching me prompt craft into ChatGPT, right? And ChatGPT actually seems to be a little bit slower here. And I don't really know if there's rhyme or reason to this. Sometimes the servers are just busy, I guess.
Yeah, could be it.
Now, typically when I've done this prompt in the past, this has a pretty bad bug, similar to the one that we saw before, which was it gave a pretty good response for code that would work, but it used completely the wrong URL again. And it took me a couple of minutes to step through and debug and try and figure out what the issue was before I actually found it. And I found that that's actually been happening more often than not. For very simple types of applications, if you're trying to write a script that goes through files in your directory, something that's very generic, ChatGPT is fantastic, gets it every single time. And then the more and more specific you get, the more that you have to debug yourself. Because of the way that ChatGPT is trained, I guess, it becomes rather difficult, I found, for it to it always tries to create the most generic answers, but when you're using specific APIs and specific products, it starts to goof a little bit.
Yeah. Part of the reason it's as good as it is at interacting with Smarty's APIs is because our documentation on our website is pretty thorough, and it was able to it was trained on that, as well as our open source SDKs. So we have a Python SDK, and we're not showing that being used here, but all of that code is part of ChatGPT's training data as well. That's part of the reason it does as good of a job as it does.
But you'll see right here, this URL, we don't have a Geo API sublink. I think it's pulling that from probably a completely different service.
Yeah, that could be.
But it's just trying.
So speaking of where it's trying to get that information, where is it getting information about Smarty's APIs to construct the code? Did you guys feed it in, or did it pull from the 2021 website documentation?
That was part of its training data. So they used everything publicly available, OpenAI did, as well as all open source software on GitHub and other locations as part of their training data for the neural net. And that's where this is coming from.
Our documentation's all out there.
We have a bunch of documentation. We have a bunch of sample code, especially in Python, that's all out there for open use out on the web. And ChatGPT has been trained on that. And you'll be able to see a lot of the sample code, or a lot of the code that ChatGPT is sending us is eerily familiar to a lot of the sample code that we have out there, which is good. I mean, that's why we have the sample code out there. The sample code that we have is made to just copy paste with your specific addresses. And ChatGPT is taking that and attempting to do essentially the same thing. It doesn't get it perfect. With this URL is sort of the biggest offender that I've seen consistently.
Right.
But it does a pretty good job.
So I guess that becomes a risk that you have to learn how to mitigate, where you go, I want it to deal with this code, and I know that code is available online, but that code was probably updated in 2022. So I need to paste in some reference code to start with and then keep going, knowing that it's probably eating up and storing that copy and pasted code.
Yeah. One of the places I found ChatGPT in respect to coding very useful is that, say I don't know anything about a certain topic. I don't know how to use Smarty's reverse geo API. I don't know what it does. I can go and read through all their documentation, which is recommended, or it can be
Even
lazy.
if you're using ChatGPT.
Yeah, or you can go in and start asking ChatGPT to use that API endpoint and generate some code. You can start playing with the code. That it's kind of a way to explore the API yourself, not for production code, but to learn about it. Then you can go back and revisit the documentation, and you kind of have a clear idea of the questions you have and what you want to learn from the documentation. Just going straight into documentation and reading it is generally not as conducive, or you don't learn as much.
A little dry.
Yeah, it's a little dry. But if you have some experience playing around with the technology before you read the documentation, you get a lot more out of your readings and your study.
So I'm just going to go ahead and fix the URL. We've talked about it to death, but here's the real URL that I've ran into this bug consistently and just sort of prepped for it. So here we have it. Here we have the reverse geocode API here, or the reverse geocode function that ChatGPT produced, goes through, hits our endpoint, has all of the correct parameters and tries to spit it out, and then ideally should return a list of close addresses. So now that we fixed the URL, let's give that a shot. And 404 error, great. No address is found. So it looks like, again, that it was not found for this particular URL. And the reason why is, I believe, actually due to the lookup. This needs to be street address / lookup, I believe. And just real quick, we can try it 404 again. Now here's where we start to get to the real tedious part of development, because this is a completely different error.
So it should be, it's not street address because we're looking for latitude and longitude, right? What is the endpoint? It might just be lookup.
We can figure out our very own documentation to go through that, which I know is fun for everyone, right? So let's just go to our US street. And then we can go to our US rooftop geocoding or not a rooftop geocoding, I apologize. The reverse geocoding, thank you. You're right, it is not just lookup. It's just lookup.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Watching you guys fix the bugs, that's the real lesson we're learning here.
And it appears that we still got a bug. And this is a bug that I've dealt with before, actually. This is another consistent bug.
The string indices must be integers.
Correct. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to read through the JSON without realizing that there's one more level of depth. And so without going through the whole debug process, I actually have the fix right here. And so instead of data, we have to do data sub-results. And this should spit out. It does not. Great.
We're closer though. Now it can't find candidate sub delivery line 1, it looks like.
Okay. And so once again, let's put a debug statement here and take a look at what it's doing. I'm going to have to empty out our auth token once again. Oops. And let's go through a debug. And so here we have candidate.
Yeah, that delivery line 1, it hallucinated that based on our US Street API, which is interesting. These candidates are different. The API that, or what gets returned is different in the candidate.
Could you specify what you mean by hallucinate?
So ChatGPT, the way it's built, it's just the next most plausible word after the previous word. And our US Street API, we have a lot more code that references that. The documentation is longer, for various reasons. It thinks that anything smarty is going to be the US Street API. And so it made up or hallucinated that the candidate for this API endpoint, which is reverse geo, has the same fields as US Street. The term that the AI people use is hallucinate, but it really just means that it made up some code that doesn't actually run or work.
So it seems like that this is a pretty pervasive problem when using ChatGPT or other language model things for code, is that it can hallucinate some of these solutions. As a developer, what's the best way to deal with it?
You can actually let ChatGPT know, hey, this is incorrect, and it doesn't look like candidate sub US or delivery line 1 exists. What's the correct index that I should be using there? And a lot of the time it'll actually correct it and get it right the second time. That's one way. The other way, again, is just to go back to the documentation and start to look at that.
Just manual debug, right?
Yeah. You'll have an idea what to go look for.
So now that we've tweaked the code a little bit, it looks like once we fix the data sub results, and instead of candidate delivery line 1, which is, like Ryan said, our US street variant of that, we're instead doing sub address, and it does indeed look like that we get close addresses, and it gets the 10 closest addresses around this geocode. Cool. And so now all we have to do is the final step, which is tie these things together. So we need to then say, okay, write another function that takes these two other functions and ties them together. And I found that it works best if you actually give as much detail as you possibly can by actually using the function names. And let's go back and get the other function name, which is just reverse geocode. Should have taken an address. Return a list of close addresses. Return a list of close addresses. Now, note, though, that this prompt here is almost identical to the prompt that we used in the very beginning, which is just the general prompt. Write a function that takes an address and returns a list of close addresses. But now it has the context. We've already ran through sort of the sub parts that we've needed in order to get a really good solution. Ideally, let's see if it actually works.
Hey, we got our speed back for ChatGPT.
Yeah, I don't know what happened with that middle prompt, with that reverse geocoding prompt. It seemed to take a long time.
It did.
So here we have, so now get close addresses actually uses both functions. It uses the get geocode in order to get the geocode. It extracts the latitude and longitude out of it, and then passes the latitude and longitude into close addresses. So let's plug this in, and you know what? I could just click the copy code button. And it even gave us some sample code for us to run.
It's that bad address again.
Yeah, we're going to have to replace that, but you know, we can make it work. I should really have copied this instead of typing it every time. So let's see what it does. And there we go. So now we have a complete code solution that you type in an address, and it gives you the 10 closest addresses to the address you plugged in, including itself. We could write more code that goes through and enhances this functionality. One thing that I find a little bit ugly is that we're redefining the auth ID and auth token every single time that we write the functions that pass them in. There's a bunch of stuff that we can do to clean this up. But as a general solution, I feel like this is pretty good.
Yeah. It's a great way to get your hands into the code and start using it while you learn about it. ChatGPT is really useful for that.
That's excellent. Do you mind if, before we jump into a Q&A, do you mind if I take over your screen?
Of course.
Okay, you do mind?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Let's go to this one. Nope, what do you guys see?
Just your name.
My name?
Yeah.
Come on now. Zoom sometimes really doesn't like me. Well,
And so while you're figuring that out, I will say that it's actually been a really fascinating experience working with ChatGPT. It was really nice having it write out all the boilerplate. And I can't emphasize enough how little experience I have in Python. But, in the 30-minute coding session, live coding session that we had today, we're able to create a pretty awesome product live while we're doing the webinar about finding an address, inputting an address and getting a list of all of its neighbors, which is a pretty sophisticated application, I might say. If I had to go through and use a lot of the documentation and do it myself, this might have taken, even 4 times longer if I was really trying to do it. And ChatGPT just straight up wrote all of the boilerplate code. Yeah, had some bugs, but we went through and able to fix them and came out with a pretty good product.
That's great. It's been pointed out to me that we are already quite a bit over time, so we won't take any questions. If you guys have questions, please reach out to us. If you go to smarty.com, in the bottom right corner, there's a little chat bubble that goes to real people. So if you want to chat in there, you can talk to our support team or our sales team, and they're happy to work. They'll often connect with you guys and say, hey, how do we find these answers if they don't have them already? If you want to play around with ChatGPT, but you don't have a Smarty account with lookups, you can get a free trial that gives you 1,000 lookups to play with. And then you can do this exact same thing we did today and just tie it in with your trial account, and it'll count against those 1,000 lookups. So you can get that at smarty.com/signup, or smarty.com and click on the get free trial up in the corner. And then I also included the address data glossary. As you guys are working through building these samples or these playing with ChatGPT, it may be helpful to know the definition of some of our address information. So you can find that there at smarty.com/articles/glossary. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Ryan. This has been very, very useful. We've already had a lot of people saying thank you. So we're glad you guys took the time out of your day to do this. And we hope to see both of you on more webinars, and all of you that are watching on our future webinars as well. Have a great day.